You're listening to Prep Period, the only podcast for teachers that's focused on quick wins and actionable tips that can be implemented in your classroom tomorrow. Prep Period starts in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to the Prep Period Podcast. My name is Brian Bean. I'm your host as usual. In today's episode, we're going to discuss how ELL students, your English language learners, how they can be a major benefit for your classes. We're also going to talk about how to teach ELL students from what's called an asset-based perspective, rather than a deficiency perspective. And I'm very excited. Our guest today is Lauren Bartholomae. She's from the Norfolk Public School System in Virginia. So welcome, Lauren. First things first, let's get our listeners a little bit more familiar with you, Lauren. So Lauren Bartholomae is an educator specializing in using STEM/STEAM initiatives to transcend English language learning boundaries in the secondary classroom. Her work focuses on immigrant and refugee newcomers and their cross-curricular experiences in U.S. classrooms. Lauren earned her master's in education from Lehigh University and is pursuing her doctorate in education at Vanderbilt University and happens to be a fellow in my cohort. So shout out to Vandy. So with that, Lauren, I'm so excited to have you on our podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Before we dive into all these other questions, I'm just curious, what got you into this particular niche within education? What drove you in this direction?
So I've always been fascinated with international just differences, cultural differences, religious differences, political differences. And at the same time, I always saw a power of education. I was always tutoring or working somehow in the classroom. And when I had the opportunity to earn my master's at Lehigh, there happened to be a perfect program that married both, and it was called Globalization and Educational Change. And I dove in there and recognized all these disparities that I felt we experience around our world, that education could solve it, and that we had so much to learn from one another. And so that is kind of how I got interested in that area. And then my story, which connects to a lot of what we're going to talk about today. As an educator, I had this glassy-eyed, perfect version, not realizing that working with diverse students means that comes with diverse languages.
Right.
And that's not something that you can prepare to, no matter how great of a day-to-day teacher you are, if you're not equipped with the right tools to break those barriers. So that kind of hit me flat in the face for my first few years of teaching at a super diverse school. And I grew to love it from there.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned it. So my first couple of years teaching, I was in a very homogenous school. And it just didn't, I just didn't have to deal with it. Then I moved to Houston, and obviously the diversity in Houston versus Utah is going to be a little different. And I'm not gonna lie, it was like, you know, this huge culture shock. You know, we've talked about before how the statistics show that, you know, ELL learners, the numbers are just growing so rapidly, and it's not just in urban areas. And so, you know, if you're teaching for any amount of time, it's inevitable. You're going to have to work with students who don't necessarily have English as their first language, you know. And so, you know, rather than focusing on the negative, because there's a lot of teachers out there that get intimidated by it. It's a challenge that they might not be prepared for, like you alluded to. So instead, let's focus on the positive. So my first question for you then, how can having ELL students in your class enhance our experience, you know, as educators?
Definitely. Well, first and foremost, our English learners bring so much to the classroom. So instead of being scared at them, we can look at what they're actually offering to us and our students by being in the room. They have different life experiences, they have different perspectives, additional linguistics abilities, And they can just demonstrate both to us and our students that there's more than one experience, more than one dimension. As we think through problems, maybe they have different ways to look at it, different things to offer, different connections that they can make that kind of enhance both our experience as educators and also as examples to the other students. And I think that depending on their background, they went through a lot typically with their families to get to that journey into the classroom. And they are normally so excited when they feel like they can contribute to it as well. Yeah. And as educators, we always look for those light bulb moments, and we know that that feeling when it finally turns on. And so being able to bridge the access for our harder to reach learners feels just as good for us too. It's very satisfying.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Now we have talked in other conversations as well that you and I have had, and you've talked about pre-screening. Like pre-screening as being kind of one of the best ways to become comfortable with your ELL students. So you can kind of focus on their assets of the individual and their culture.
Definitely. So we need to kind of adopt this lens of, okay, as soon as this kid gets in my room, I'm going to focus on what they're bringing to it and what they can do rather than get hung up on what they can't do. And so the best way to pre-screen is to get to know where they come from, what their scores are, and how you can capitalize on those strengths and those connections that you can build, and have them step into your classroom already feeling welcome and seen. So unfortunately, so often as educators, we are bogged down by so many things, and those things keep multiplying and accumulating. Yeah. And so those little things that even you just like saying, okay, you have a new student today, looking where they're from so you can like greet them in that language or have that flag in your classroom will help so much.
Really? Even just a little thing like the flag in the classroom. I hadn't thought about that.
Absolutely. So our students are always trying to see themselves in kind of what we do. Right. So there's a big wave that we all are familiar with now with culturally responsive teaching. Right. Yeah. And that just means being super responsive to the differences in cultures that our students represent in our classroom and responding to them by our examples and in our content. So we need to be considerate, and normally that's presented in diversity within the traditional U.S. classroom. However, considering ELs in this classroom, even if there's just one student that represents a certain culture or race, we want to see them included in the classroom as well.
Oh, for sure. So on that note, let's talk about, what are some ways that teachers can do, like little things, like you'd mentioned the flags. What are some little things that teachers can do just to utilize the environment, their actual classroom environment itself, to help kind of bridge that gap, ease those tensions, help the ELL students as well as help the students that aren't ELL become comfortable with each other?
For sure. And as we've spoken about before, creating a safe space in your classroom community is a prerequisite to learning any academic materials. So if we want our students to contribute to the class as well as take things away, they need to feel a part of that community. And decorations are, as you mentioned, such an essential part of that. So just making your classroom feel like a welcoming place, actually putting up decorations in the first place helps a lot, because those bare walls can be very intimidating. And then including them in the decorations. So for one instance, having students pin a map of where they're from or where they identify with, or even where they want to go if they feel like we just want these kids to feel seen and feel a part of it. And that generates a lot of conversation amongst the students as well. Oh, you live there, you're from there, what's it like? And that helps build that community really strong.
I love that idea. Okay, I want to shift gears just a little bit. We've talked a lot about making the environment a safe place. But now I want to talk a little bit about one of the things that is the scariest part for the educator. It's intimidating to teach ELL students at times, particularly if you're in a subject where there might be some vocabulary that's challenging for English learners. I would imagine that could be that much more intimidating, but at the same time, having high expectations, because I don't think you're doing anybody any favors by lowering expectations. You still want to focus on high expectations, but how do you balance that with maintaining an appropriate level, taking into consideration your students' circumstances? How do you find that balance?
And I think that's such an important question, and where a lot of us fall short, because we all know that we want to value our students and make them feel welcome. But how do we hold them accountable? Because they are here to learn and they do need to learn. The overall message is definitely to capitalize on their strengths. So how do you find those strengths to capitalize on? You have to look at their score report. So
the score.
Brilliant. Yeah, mind-blowing. Use the data.
The totally intuitive, very self-explanatory score that all of us teachers are familiar with.
And we have so many different scores for so many different children, for so many different tests. But this one, I swear, if you just glance over this score report that I will briefly overview in a second, it's very self-explanatory, and it will give you so much insight onto what your students can and cannot do and how to adjust your expectations appropriately based on that.
Okay, well, let's dive into that. So first things first, which score are we talking about?
Okay, great question. We are talking about typically a WIDA access score.
WIDA, and that's WIDA, WIDA?
Their assessments are used, and standards are used now by over 40 U.S. states and territories, and the remaining ones use very similar assessments. So please look for your students' WIDA access score or something very similar. What that score report should identify is an overall composite score for your students, which we all know are give us general ideas.
Yeah,
but
they don't tell the whole. They don't tell a true picture of what happened.
Exactly, and the true picture is really kind of the make or break for how we reach our ELs. So the composite score, we generally use that to classify them, but beyond that, it's not very helpful. When we talk about managing our expectations, we want to adjust those. So if their strength is in speaking and listening, we use those for assessments. And we use those to look for our higher level performance. So maybe the student can't write an essay, but maybe orally they can have a conversation or a debate with you to demonstrate that. Maybe they can create,
or vice versa. They might be much better at writing it down.
Absolutely.
Than speaking.
Exactly. So just being open to being flexible with these alternative assessments, because in the end that will help you more, because they'll be producing things that you can work with.
Yeah. Well, and I like the emphasis on, I should say, like the de-emphasis of the composite, because if you just look at the composite, it might say, on a scale of 1 to 4?
So different states have different cutoffs. 6 is considered proficient, but most states exit kids around 4 point something.
Gotcha. So you might have a student that comes in at a 4, but it's because one skill is really good and the others are really lacking. But if you just assume they're a 4, therefore they should be able to do all of it fairly well, then you're not doing that student any favors whatsoever.
Absolutely. And we don't want to alienate them, and we don't want to cause them stress, and we don't want you to be disappointed in what they're producing as well.
I like it. Now, earlier I did a little bit of research on the WIDA, and there's this thing called can-do descriptors. Okay, so can you explain what those are and how we use them?
Absolutely. So when I proposed this topic, I said we are trying to look at our English learners from an asset-based perspective. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what WIDA tries to support us in doing when they have these can-dos. So what can these students do in each of these domains at each of these levels? So it is this asset-based formula for us to navigate. So first off, you have to have that student score report, which we should receive them as like we receive IEPs and 504s at the beginning of the year. You should receive them. If not, you definitely please contact your interventionist or ESL teacher or coach or whoever that person is.
Somebody on campus has that report.
Somebody has them, because legally they will be in big trouble if nobody does at that school. So somebody has them, find that person. It is a one-page report, like I said, not too time consuming. So an example of this is if you see a student and that student is a level 3 in listening, but a level 1 in speaking. And you say, okay, I know I have to adjust my expectations, but what does that mean? What is a 3? So you find listening and you find 3, and you kind of like make your fingers meet in the middle of the boxes. And then you see like, quote, this student in listening can categorize content-based examples from oral directions.
Gotcha. Basically, these can-dos, they literally, instead of making you try to figure out what a 3 means in this area, it says if they're at a 3 in this area, here are things they can do. So it gives you a direction to start looking at and focusing in. It's a starting point. Well, I hate to do this, but we're going to have to wrap it up. There's so much great information that is out there and available. Is there a website that people could go to learn more about some of these can-do descriptors for WIDA? Because let's say they're at one of the states that doesn't use that assessment. Where could they go to get more information?
Absolutely. You can literally just Google WIDA.
WIDA.
WIDA, specifically the can-do descriptors. People have done the legwork. Use your ESL point person in your building. Use the WIDA can-dos and just try it out.
I love it. I think it's fantastic. Thank you so much for coming onto our program and sharing this information with, because, a lot of teachers, they just don't understand this world. They don't know it. They didn't go to school to learn this, most likely. Like in my case, I went to school to learn geology, right? And so this is a new part of the job that they weren't expecting, and to add any level of clarity, it just makes their lives easier, which makes the students' lives better. And so thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much.
So one final thought for the day. First, thank you very much to Lauren for coming onto the show. I learned a tremendous amount. And I think this is a topic that is worth exploring more. I love the idea of using your classroom as an environment to really celebrate students and their backgrounds. I like the idea of maybe even bringing, first day of school kind of get to know you assignment where students go and find out a little bit about their ancestry and their heritage. Then come to class and we put a big map up on the board, and they put pins or put circles on the map of the world as to where their ancestry, their genealogy goes back to, as a way to just kind of open up conversations and show all the students, including the ELL students, that we're all from way different parts of the world than the little nook that we live in now. I love that idea. I think it opens up a lot of doors for conversations and inclusion. So with that, thank you very much for listening to the episode. As usual, if you or anyone you know would like to be a guest on our show, have them reach out to me at brian.bean@stukent.com. That's Brian with an I, .bean, just like the vegetable, at stukent.com. Thanks for listening.